Good afternoon. That was really special. Good afternoon. All right. I'm going to read to you from Psalm 127 as I begin. Psalm 127 says, "Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. It is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for so he giveth his beloved sleep. Lo, children are heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. Happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with the enemies in the gate." So Psalm 127 famously says that unless God builds the house, everybody laboring at building is laboring in vain. Their work is worthless. Their work is empty. And it says unless God guards a city, the watchman, the security team, they're doing that work, and it's in vain. They can't keep the city safe unless God keeps the city safe. So only God can build sturdy houses and families, and only God keeps and establishes cities, and by extension, nations. So that's how the psalm opens. And those two things go together. Houses and cities. Families, cities, nations. Those things all go together. It's not just talking about physical structures. It's talking about people. It's talking about families and nations. Families are the building block of society. Families are the building block of human society, what you might call the nucleus of society, and that's where we actually got the phrase nuclear family. If you've ever heard that phrase before, nuclear family, the idea is that family is the nucleus. Family is the building block of society. So when we talk about the next generation of families, we talk about building the next generation of families, we're talking then also about the next generation of cities and nations. The quality of family, the quality of house you have, is going to be directly connected to the quality of city you have. And the quality of city you have is going to be connected to the quality of nation you have. So when we talk about building the next generation of families, we're also inevitably talking about the next generation of cities and nations. Now, Psalm 127 says that even an intense work ethic can't do it. It says you can stay up late and you can get up early, and that still won't build you a good house and keep your city safe. It says even if you're eating the bread of sorrows, even if you're stressing about it, even if you're stress eating about it, it's not good enough. These things do not build families or keep cities safe. Okay? Even a good work ethic, as good as it is, even stress, even anxiety, even an intensity of saying, I'm going to watch all the details really, really carefully. Even those things, which there can be good versions of that and bad versions of that. The psalm says that's not what builds a strong house, keeps a city safe. They are not the true productive engine that God uses to build generations. Psalm 127 says that God builds houses and guards cities through the gift of children. That's what it says. It says, unless God builds houses, you can't build it. Unless God guards cities, you can't guard it. He says you can stay up late, you can get up early, you can be worried, stressed, you can give all your attention to it. Doesn't matter. And then it says, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. How does God build houses? How does God build successful nations? Through the gift of children. Psalm 127 says that children are the inheritance of the Lord. They're his fruitful reward. An inheritance, you know this, is a gift passed down to future generations. An inheritance, maybe some of you have even received an inheritance, or maybe your parents or your grandparents have received an inheritance. Maybe you had an elderly relative pass away and leave you an inheritance. Or maybe you've been told that your grandparents have left you in their will some inheritance. An inheritance is a gift passed down to future generations for the purpose of launching new generations further. In Proverbs it says that a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. A good man is trying to save up an inheritance, build an inheritance, build wealth, possessions, knowledge, gifts to then bless his grandkids with. That's what a good man is aiming to do, it says in Proverbs. In the Old Testament, you might remember that the firstborn son usually received a double portion of the inheritance because it was his job to carry on his father's house and to care for his parents in their old age. You might sometimes wonder, how come the firstborn got a double? That kind of seems unfair. Well, it was the firstborn's job not only to carry on the legacy of his father, but he got to take care of mom and dad when they were old. So he got extra to take care of mom and dad. But Psalm 127 says that children are God's inheritance. So you might be reasonably looking forward to and expecting inheritance from your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents. But this passage says that you also can have an inheritance from God. Children are God's inheritance. Children are God's double portion for us to build the next generation. God gives children for building houses and watching over cities, guarding cities. It also says that children are the fruit of the womb, and they are God's reward. It says they're God's reward. The word for reward is also sometimes translated as wages or payment. This means that children are wealth. Children are wealth. This is because human beings are the most valuable resource in the universe. Human beings are the most valuable resource in the universe. And they're the most valuable resource in the universe because they're the only part of creation made in the image of God. So human beings are the most valuable part of the universe, the most valuable resource in the universe because they are made in the image of God. And so this helps make sense of when it says children are God's main resource, God's main inheritance. He gives people. He gives people. That's how he builds houses. That's how he prospers nations. Think for a second about abortion. Abortion is not only a great and wicked evil, an awful tragedy. But if you think about it like this means it's also like a form of madness and insanity. We're destroying the most valuable resource in the universe by killing unborn babies. If somebody, if you saw somebody just throwing $100 bills into a fire, like real ones, I assume you'd think, what's wrong with you? You're insane. What are you doing? Just throwing it away. Just ripping it up, burning it up. You're insane. Human beings are even more valuable than that. And we're destroying. Just flushing it down the drain. Think for a second. How many brilliant scientists, amazing painters, gifted mathematicians, composers, inventors have we killed in abortion? Would we have cured cancer by now? Among the 65 million, how many Einsteins were there? How many Wright brothers? All that wealth thrown away. The psalm closes by calling children arrows in the hand of a mighty warrior. It says not only are they these resources, not only are they this wealth, not only are they this reward, not only are they this inheritance, he says they are also reinforcements. They are also weapons. They're arrows in the hand of a mighty warrior. And it explains that they make men happy. It says, happy is the man whose quiver is full of them. They make men happy and unashamed because those children join their fathers standing for goodness and beauty and truth in the city gates. It says they will speak with his enemies in the gates, in the public square, in the city. So there's your strong house building a strong city. And they're helping guard the city by speaking with enemies, contradicting enemies, driving the enemies out. So children are weapons and reinforcements. Children are the ordinary way that God builds houses and guards cities. So how do we build the next generation of families? How do we build the next generation of families? We can think of this in at least two ways. At least two ways. First, you want them to be the inheritance, reward, and reinforcements of your own parents now. How do we build the next generation of houses and cities? Be the inheritance. You are the inheritance of God for your parents. You are the reward of God for your parents. You are the reinforcements and the weapons that have been handed to your parents. You are that. You're their children. So be that. And then second, prepare to welcome and raise your own children in the Lord. So be the inheritance, be the reward, be the reinforcements of your parents, and prepare to welcome and raise your own children to be more inheritance, more reward, more reinforcements. And, truth be told, the first way is actually the best way to do the second. Being the inheritance, reward, and reinforcements of your parents is you preparing to welcome your own children. You being that inheritance is preparing you to welcome that inheritance. A generation in the Bible is about 40 years. In the Bible, a generation is about 40 years. Modern sociologists sometimes shrink it down to about 25 to 30 years. But in the ancient world and in the Bible, a generation is about 40 years. And right now, at least, the average lifespan in America is right at about 80 years. Okay? Which means that, on average, all of us here will get about 2 generations worth of life in. Okay? Generation's 40 years, average lifespan is 80. We're all going to get roughly around 2 generations worth of time. Now, your most productive years are probably from about the age 30 to 70. On average, it's the latter third of a person's life that's oftentimes the most productive and fruitful. So roughly about 30 to 70 are going to be your most fruitful years. That means that your first 30 years are largely resource gathering. So your first 30 years are your resource gathering. You're building and you're gathering, getting ready to produce, getting ready to build. You're gathering all your supplies. So think of those first 30 years as gathering your supplies. This is initially supplies like learning to talk, learning to walk, learning to eat. Okay, that's important. Life skills. Then you're going to spend a period of your life gathering knowledge through education. So you spend a good bit of your time, a good bit of your day in classes and then reading and writing and doing homework and so on. You're gathering knowledge of a number of subjects. You're gathering vocational skills like how to be a good communicator, how to read, how to write, how to do basic math, how to follow directions, how to learn. But you're also gathering a number of other personal skills. You're learning hand-eye coordination. You're learning exercise. You're learning eating and sleeping habits. Time management. You're learning to meet deadlines. And you're also learning spiritual and moral disciplines. Daily Bible reading, prayer, confession of your sins, worship on the Lord's Day with God's people. And ordinarily, these first 30 years are also when you will marry and begin having your own kids. So think about that. First 30 years, you're gathering knowledge, wisdom, skills, habits, disciplines, morals, all of this. And then getting married, beginning to have your own family. And you will be doing all of this while your own parents are in the middle of their most productive years. So your parents are somewhere between the ages of 30 and 70, most likely. Right. So they're in their most productive years, while you're in those first 30 years gathering, preparing. And if you think about it, that means that your parents, in their most productive years, are pouring all that productivity into you. Think about that? They're giving their most productive years for you. They're pouring themselves out for you. So that you can gather. So that you can gather more. So one way you can think about being the inheritance, being the reward and the reinforcements of your parents is by loading up as much as you can during these first 30 years. Your parents are pouring out for you, and so the question is, are you receiving? They're laying their lives down for you, are you gathering? Are you being a good steward of their sacrifices? Your diligence, your hard work, your joyful spirit, your faithfulness to Christ in these years is an enormous blessing to your parents. They're pouring themselves out. Are you receiving? Are you diligently receiving? A company where the workers stay busy and joyful is way more productive than a company where the managers have to constantly check on the workers, or one where the workers are constantly screwing stuff up. Right? And just think about a company. It's like a good company is one where the managers say, hey, could you please carry this duty out? And they do it. And then they come back and they say, what's next? What can I do next? What's next? Okay, this is what I need to do next. That's a good company. But if the company is one where the manager says, I need you to do X, and like 5 hours later, you're like wondering what happened to your worker, and you go find them, and they're in the break room, rolling up pieces of paper and chucking it into the wastebasket. What happened to X? I started it, and then I didn't know where something was, and then I was thinking about something else, and then. Right? That company's not going to make it. What kind of company is your family? What kind of company is your house? What kind of worker are you? Are you a self-starter? Do you take initiative? Do you see how your parents are working for you, pouring themselves out for you, and are you busy working? What kind of house are you building? What kind of city are you helping to build? The kind of house you're building, the kind of family you're building is the kind of city you're building, which is the kind of nation you're building. Unlike ordinary bricks, you take a brick and you go and you put it on the wall. Unlike ordinary bricks, you can resist what God is building, or you can receive what God is building. Right? Unlike ordinary bricks, you can receive what God is building, or you can resist what God is building. So what is the general attitude that you have to what you're being given? What's your general attitude to what you're being given? Going to school, homework, maybe jobs, chores, time around the dinner table at night. What's your general attitude? Is it resistant or is it receptive? Are you resistant or are you receptive? Is it grateful or is it resentful? Sociologists have named the last number of generations in America. Maybe you know some of these names. They've named particular generations over the last 120 years. The greatest generation, sociologists named the generation that was born between 1901 to 1927. They're also called the GI generation, G.I. Joe. They were the ones that fought in World War II. They experienced the Great Depression. They're called the greatest generation. The next one after that is called the silent generation. They were born from 1928 to 1945. So all the people that were born between 1928 and 1945 are referred to by sociologists as the silent generation. They're called the silent generation, I guess because they were generally known for being relatively conformist. They kind of went along with the mainstream, and they were comparatively silent against the activism of some of the youth in the later generations. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, they were relatively silent. The next generation is called the baby boomers. The baby boomers were born from 1946 to 1964. Remember, 1945 is when World War II ended, and so a lot of soldiers came home. Many of them then either got married or were able to actually be with their wives, and now you have a bunch of kids. They call it, there was a significant baby boom. And there was a significant population increase. So from 1946 to 1964, the baby boomers, they were known for significant cultural shifts and a lot of economic growth. So you think about the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, you have some significant growth in companies. And you also have the sexual revolution. Both this, like a bunch of rebellion and a bunch of productivity, all at the same time. The next generation is called Generation X, 1965 to 1980. This is described often as the latchkey generation, meaning that many of them had both parents working for the first time in American history, and so kids would come home from school to an empty house. Latchkey. They let themselves in on their own. Before that, it had been often the case that mom was at home. They'd come home to mom. Generation X is the first generation where that was less common. The next generation are referred to as millennials. 1981 to 1996, sometimes the millennials are also called Generation Y, I guess because Y comes after X. They're known for growing up with digital technology, some of the first digital technologies coming out in the late 90s, early 2000s. They also lived through some major world events, the 9/11 attacks, the 2008 financial crisis, the rise of social media. Finally, Generation Z, also sometimes referred to as Zoomers, born from 1997 to 2012. That's you. You're the first generation to grow up with the internet. You don't remember a time when there wasn't internet. Smartphones, digital fluency. Now, all these categories are interesting and I think have their helpfulness in describing characteristics, generalities. I think, though there can be a temptation that comes with descriptions like this and breaking the generations into pieces like this, it can be used sometimes to divide the generations. It can be used sometimes to sort of extenuate. There's a word like that somewhere. Those differences. And perhaps also exacerbate, there's another word, tensions between generations. And sometimes we can use those kind of generational descriptions to blame one another and to resent one another. The boomers acted like this because of the silent generation. Or the Zoomers are like this because Gen X was like that. But a more biblical vision of generations sees far more continuity between generations. A biblical vision of generations ought to be looking for, hoping for, and working for continuity. We see generations as laying layers of brick in the foundation of a house or a great cathedral. You know, in the High Middle Ages, as they built some of the most beautiful cathedrals, they sometimes took decades, sometimes over 100 years to build those cathedrals. Which means that you had like architects and builders over multiple generations working on that same cathedral. And many of those builders, many of those architects knew, like, I'm going to be working for the next 30 years, 40 years until I die, and then someone else is going to take over after me, and then someone else is going to take over after me. It was a generational project. Same project, though they contributed at different places. We know that there are real sins and real failures across generations. There are real sins and real failures across generations. But the Bible says that God's plan is for his mercy to extend through generations. That's what the Bible says. The Bible says that his plan is for his mercy to extend through generations. There are sins, and sometimes it says that God visits judgments for sins to the third or fourth generation. But it says that God extends his mercy to 1,000 generations. So you can have momentary sins and curses to 3 or 4 generations max. But God says that the common line, the common theme, is mercy to 1,000 generations. So, for example, using the biblical length of a generation, 40 years, that means there's only been 150 generations since Adam. Only 150 generations since Adam. There's only been 6 generations since the founding of America. If you count a generation as 40 years, there's only been 6 generations since the founding of America. If the Lord's mercy were to literally extend to 1,000 generations, that would take us out to around 36,000 AD. We're at 2,000. 1,000 generations would be 36,000. Which would put all of us at the very, very, very beginning of human history. And most of us will get 2 generations worth to build and plant. So what are you building? What are you planting? What will your generation be known for? At the very end of the book of Malachi, the end of the Old Testament, it says this. It says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse." It's Malachi 4, 5, and 6. And then 400 years later, an angel appears to Zechariah, the high priest, when he goes into the temple. And the angel tells Zechariah that his elderly wife, who's barren, she's going to bear a son. And the angel says, he will be the one who will turn the hearts of fathers to their children. So Malachi promised that someone would come to turn the hearts of fathers to children and children to fathers. And the angel that appears to Zechariah says, your son, John the Baptist, is going to be the one that brings that. So this means that a central effect of the gospel of Jesus is the reunion of generations, turning the hearts of fathers to children and the hearts of children to their fathers. It's the healing of generational tension and curses. Parents can sin against their children, and children can sin against their parents. And this can happen more broadly across generations. Just again, for an example, abortion was legalized in 1973 under the Boomers and Generation X. But one of the great plays of Satan is to create animosity and enmity between the generations, creating bitterness and resentment. But the blood of Christ was shed to grant forgiveness and healing. The blood of Christ was shed to remove the curse of sin between the generations, so that we can get back to building strong houses and productive cities and nations to 1,000 generations. So, be the inheritance, be the reward, be the reinforcements of your parents now. That means forgive them for their sins. Don't be bitter against them. Don't resent their faults and their failings. Instead, take everything good that you can, and receive it with thankful hearts. And think big. Think long term. Think of your descendants in 36,000 AD. What do you want to leave to them? What do you want your generation to be remembered for? I'll stop there. I think I've got 6 minutes for questions. Yes, sir.
How would you say we can gauge what a full quiver is? Is that just as many children as possible?
Yeah, what's a full quiver? As many children as possible? Yes, but with an asterisk. Meaning, so I would say an equivalent ought to be, so how much money ought you to aim to have? And I would say as much as possible, without sinning. Okay? So, which means though, that you have to take a whole lot of things into account. It's a sin to be greedy, it's a sin to be covetous, all those kind of things. And so when it comes to bearing children, you have to take into account, are you receiving the children that you've been given well? Are you taking care of them well? How's your wife doing? How is her health? All of those things matter. You can also think about a farmer taking care of his field. How much crop should a farmer aim for? I would say as much as possible, maximize it. But if you just plant the same thing and grow the same thing year after year after year after year, you know what happens. The nutrients fall apart in the soil. You have to give it rest years. You have to let it recover. Sometimes we live right next to fields, and they plant different things in the field different years to allow different nutrients to build back up in the soil. There's analogous sorts of principles that need to apply to bearing children. So I would say, in general, yeah, as many as you can, but can is going to qualify that. You want to be a faithful farmer, a good steward. Yes, ma'am. Who should rebuke them if parents sin against their child? I would say it depends on the kind of sin that it is. Okay? There's, in the Bible, there's sin that it says that love covers a multitude of sins. And then it also says that if your brother sins against you, go to him and tell him your sin between you and him alone. And then there's also sins that are also fall under other jurisdictions. And it might be good to tell a pastor or a police officer, depending. So you got three different things there. So love covers a multitude of sins, and I would say that's your daily bumps. So if your mom gets a little upset at you and raises her voice, and you can tell she was angry, I would say ordinarily you let love cover that. Hopefully she comes back to you later and says, honey, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said it like that. Right? And you say, I forgive you. But I would say that kind of thing, you cover in love. And covering it in love means you just say, Jesus died for it. I'm not going to bring it up. Lots of sin gets covered in love. Okay? But I would say maybe if it's done some kind of damage or harm, or something needs to be fixed, like there's a lie, they lied to you, or promised something and then didn't do it, there's something that needs to actually get fixed, then I would say you can lovingly confront. And at a certain level, I think a kid can bring something up to a parent and say, Mom, Dad, remember that one time you said this? I was wondering because it looks like you did this. What do you think? There's a respectful way of raising that. You're not coming in accusing. You're not coming in guns blazing. And I think a child can do that. It needs to be done respectfully, but you can ask. I'd say frame it as a question. Now, if it's the kind of thing, though, that a law has been broken, this will also include things like some kind of sexual sin. Those kind of things probably need to be told to an adult like a pastor or sometimes a police officer. Because those are authorities that have the right, if it's a crime that's been committed, for example, well, God's appointed police officers to help us sort out crimes. Or if it's a sin that a pastor needs to help sort out, then you can talk to a pastor and ask a pastor to help address the situation. Good question. One more quick one.